We're going to be reacting to a video, Theism is Irrational, by Stephen from Rationality Rules. And in this, he presents an argument which is very popular against theism, which says that it is not rational to believe in an all-good and all-powerful God on the basis of the so-called problem of evil. So we'll be addressing that from the perspective of the CTMU model. I'm here with my friend Adam from CTMUist, who is another CTMU theorist who will give his perspective as well.
Yeah, so in his video, Stephen, he presents his case that theism is irrational, and what we're going to hope to prove is that the CTMU model not only undermines his case, but also provides us with a rational interpretation of an all-loving and all-powerful God.
Why, hello, my fellow apes. I hope you are well. As a naturalist, I'm convinced that your time as a conscious being is limited, and so I consider every minute you grant me to be of infinite value.
So first here, Stephen says that he begins by defining a scale of value in which time has a positive, maybe even infinite utility. So it's not clear whether, just on the basis of this, on whether the author is an atheist, and this seems to be actually a very strong theist claim that will come up later in the video as kind of rebutting his argument. So he introduces something that is fatal to his argument at the very beginning, but maybe he's just saying that facetiously.
Thank you. As not to waste said time, let's not beat around the burning bush. When one speaks of theism within our culture, they are almost always referring to capital G God. That is, the God of Abraham. Theism, then, for our purposes, is the proposition that an all-powerful and all-loving God exists.
Yeah, so I and Adam both accept this definition. This is the God that we're defending. So this is the fair terms of debate. Although nowhere, at least in the biblical scriptures, does it say that God is all-loving. In the epistles of John, it says that God is love, which is quite a different claim. And without a definition of love, which he doesn't provide, there's no way to put forth your preferred version of morality, which on the basis of this video is this kind of shallow version of utilitarianism based on the pleasure principle, which says that the only thing of positive value is creating the greatest possible pleasure for the most amount of people. So obviously, the world that we live in does not have infinite pleasure, and it actually has quite a bit of pain. And so he's attempting to say that God does not maximize pleasure, so therefore God is not good or not all-powerful, therefore no God, or at least no God as defined here. But this is a circular argument because it defines that which is of value and assumes that theists agree with this definition without proving it. And actually, we've discussed this, and actually I nor Adam actually agree with the definition of utility and value as being related to pleasure fundamentally.
So yeah, just going back to the definition. So when we're defining what all-powerful and all-loving mean, I want to just introduce what we mean by that. So the concept of model here becomes relevant because he can interpret theism through his model, and his interpretation will be different to someone else's if they have a different model. So your model is where your definitions are. So how we define these things affects the final analysis. All-powerful in the CTMU means self-configuration at the highest level. All obviously means global, and powerful means the ability to configure. So configuration requires a function, right, to perform the configuration. So all-loving would follow from this as well. So an all-loving function in the CTMU would be a function which always produces utility or goodness at the highest level. So that's what when we're defending this all-loving, all-powerful God, that's what we mean. It's self-configuration at the global level of reality, and in such a way so that the most utility is always selected by that highest level of reality.
Yeah, exactly. And God can constrain himself in a way that doesn't violate omnipotence. So he can set an intrinsic constraint of reality, which is that it has these scales of distributed freedom, and therefore, when we're talking about morality, some of that's going to come down to free will. Is that God has actually decided that it is utile on the basis of his global value that there be free will, and therefore we can't blame any individual instance of freely willed evil on God, because God constrained himself in such a way that his secondary images will have that intrinsic freedom. So there's a little bit of a difference between the CTMU self-configuration and these traditional notions of omnipotence. And actually the former is a little bit more general.
Which entails that he has unlimited power and will always act as to create the greater good. Now,
this is another thing which is actually important, because he sneaks this definition in of the greater good as being greater, basically, pleasure. But positive utility, the good, is not about how things make us feel, but rather what is of value to reality. And there's overlap, but it's not 100%. God, being the global identity of reality, is panpsychic, which means that any mind within the universe is connected to his mind and is therefore part of his experience. So therefore, that which is of value to humans, like feeling good, feeling pleasure, and so forth, is at least of partial value to God, of course, but the overlap is not totally there. So to understand this and what we mean when we say God is all-loving versus what Stephen is trying to argue against when he says theists say God is all-loving, is that love is actually the merging of identities, that two people who love each other are merging their identities, and they say that what is of value to you is also of value to me. So they're merging their value or utility functions. And God being all loving, being basically extends that utility function over all of existence. So he shares an identity with all of reality and takes into account everything of value in the universe. And so God, defined in this way, could not have any deviation from utility, because all utility is self-utility.
Yeah, so the merging of identity is relevant in terms of what you just said, because for us to be good essentially just means for us to merge, to select utility in the same way that God selects utility. But yeah, just going back to definitions, the greater good on the CTMU model would just mean the self-selection of reality by global reality's own self-configuration, which is the global utility function. On our theistic model, God always selects for the greatest good through this function by disallowing defectors, those who misuse the utility function to create disutility, to progress to reality's higher levels, i.e. that just means that they go out of existence.
Define rationality. Rationality is the quality of being based on or in accordance with reason or logic. And I think it's best conveyed through an example. Hundreds of years ago, it was rational to believe that diseases such as cholera, chlamydia, and the Black Death were caused by miasma, bad air. After all, wherever there was foul odors, such as by sewers and crowded urban slums, there were diseases. Belief in miasma was based on the best evidence of the day. It was a rational belief. Today, however, we know that these diseases are not caused by bad air. We in fact have so much evidence to the contrary that we now consider it irrational to believe the miasma theory of disease. A belief is rational, then, if and only if that belief is in accordance with the reason and evidence available to the believer. So, yes, most of our beliefs are rational, but that doesn't mean that they're true. Whether something is true and whether something is rational are two different propositions. And of the beliefs we hold that are not rational, we typically maintain them because we haven't considered, much less even recognized, the absence of their evidential and logical support. Instead, we've leaned on intuition, authoritative figures, and cognitive bias. That said, there is a pretty famous other way of maintaining irrational beliefs that some even venerate, namely faith. Per Hebrews 11, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen.
So yeah, I mean, he's trying to say that faith isn't rational, but I don't see the mutual exclusivity there. So he described faith as meaning things hoped for and evidence of things unseen, and he described rational as in accordance with reason or logic. But logic and reason are also unseen, so that part doesn't contradict. And hope isn't necessarily divorced from reason or logic. So faith, which typically means trust, depends on logic because faith is a function of knowledge, and identification requires logic. So For example, when we hope or trust in something, it's because we have knowledge about some pattern. And even if we don't know all the details, we can come to some conclusion that we trust in due to logic. So, I mean, he hasn't proven a mutual exclusivity between faith and rationality. It's all just a definition issue that's arising from his model.
Yeah, exactly. And the way that he's defining faith as the evidence of things not seen could just as easily be a definition of logic, just as you said, is that it's basically is something that's not directly provable by experience, but provable within a global logical model. So ultimately, faith, in the way that we think about it in the CTMU, entails the specification of that global model. And faith is a belief state that you can arrive at through interpretation and logic, and therefore there's not a separation between faith and logic, but these two things are actually intrinsically connected to each other.
Yeah, just mean faith is just when you don't know all the details, because it means trust, right? We trust based on a pattern, and we establish the pattern through logic.
Yeah, exactly.
To have faith is to believe in a proposition despite there not being sufficient evidence for doing so. So there's our keywords front and center. Now we can delve into the juicy parts, and we'll start with the worm in Adam's apple, the problem of evil. By virtue of God being all-powerful, we know that he can prevent evil. And by virtue of him being all-loving, we know that he wants to prevent evil.
Okay, so this is again where the problem of modeling is going to come in. So some theists may say that in their model, God wants to prevent evil. But we could just say that God distributes free will onto sentient beings and gives them the utility function to detect utility and disutility, and that he just relies on us to decide what we are, like for us to decide whether we are good or we are evil by selecting utility or by selecting disutility. God simply just then in turn selects those of us who select utility and disallows those of us who select disutility from remaining in reality. It doesn't matter. It doesn't necessarily. We can have a model that doesn't impose that desire onto God, that God wants to prevent evil, because then we're tied into the idea that God has to act against evil himself. Like we could just have a model where God provides us with a perfect world, like so a world where we have the option of selecting between utility and disutility, between good and evil, but it's our job to select the one that's good for us. So we don't necessarily have to accept this assertion that God wants to prevent evil himself. We could say that God just wants us to select goodness and to not behave in an evil way ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. Is that this is an entirely snuck premise that God wants to prevent evil. It just says we know this, but it doesn't say how we know this or who is claiming this. Is that God wants people for sure not to be evil, but he does not want to prevent evil per se. That God actually establishes the potential for evil to emerge in reality as the negation of that global utility. So even though there is the possibility of actual evil, the structure of existence is not capable of preventing evil, or else you'd have to have a different suboptimal utility function that had no positive or negative value. So it's not entirely true to say that God wants to prevent evil, right?
And yet, when we stroll through the remains of mass extinctions and witness natural disasters, predation, parasitic diseases, and other forms of suffering in the world, it appears obvious, and I mean really, really obvious, that we're beset by gratuitous evil.
Okay, so that just equates suffering with evil. It's like we just says mass extinctions, suffering, therefore evil, and is basically trying to insist this by saying it's really, really obvious, but it's not obvious. So, I mean, what he's really doing is, in his model of reality, he's defining suffering to be equivalent to evil, which we don't accept. So on our model, that is just false, right? So if you have a model which either defines things incorrectly, like equating suffering and evil, or lacking important relationships between things, so we would say, those of us who believe in the CTMU, we would say that those important relationships are reality at the global level, and self-configuration of reality, and self-selection, as well as utility and disutility. Those parts are necessary for us to really understand good and evil. So any theory that you analyze with an incorrect model, like the one that Stephen is using, is going to make it seem like there's internal contradictions in theism which don't exist. So what we propose is that suffering is just an effect of how a being uses the utility function afforded to it by reality. Right? Evil would just be the deliberate selection of disutility. So it's just for itself and for others. So if you just, if a being selects disutility, stuff that tends towards non-existence, right? States which drive the system out of existence, that's what evil would be. But it's the selection, right? So you need to understand that it's the selecting function that the being does, of either utility or disutility, good or evil. That's what makes the being good or evil. It's not the outcome that makes it evil. It's not suffering that makes something evil. Suffering is just like a signal. Suffering is a signal that your body receives through the utility function, which says, stay away from this thing because this is going to drive you out of existence. So that's the reason why he's going wrong. His model doesn't have this relationship, and that's why he's conflating the two, right? So suffering equals evil because evil drives things out of existence, and so does suffering. But suffering is actually just the signal that you're going to go out of existence.
Yeah, exactly. And to that point, kind of is that if you look at biological evolution, which is affirmed by atheists and certain theists alike, is that you have to look at something like a animal dying from a volcano as something that's incredibly painful. It's also something that's utile to what evolution is putting forth as its utility function, which is the ability of life to adapt to its environment. And so if you didn't have that, then you would never be able to have anything approaching intelligence or fitness. So basically, suffering is an evolved response to the ability to adapt to life, and therefore it can't be intrinsically evil. It has to actually be something that is utile to the reality system and capable of basically allowing it to express itself in a better way. If we just had our hand on a hot stove all of the time and there was no suffering, then we'd never know to take it off and our hand would just entirely burn off. Is that it's actually helping life and helping humans in particular to adapt to their environment, and hopefully over time, as they align with the global utility, to minimize suffering over time as a model of that actually there is more positive value in the world.
It's not the case that suffering is evolved. It's that so suffering is in the utility function itself. It's a state that the utility function allows. It's just that everything, including natural selection, as a natural law and natural selection, they're just like subsets of the global self-configuration. Right? They're just a part of global self-configuration, and the utility function allows us to couple with utility or disutility or suffering and pleasure, just as a signal to move towards or away from something.
Yeah, exactly. So so that's basically a kind of primary fallacy that is sneaking in there, is that we know that God wants to prevent evil, and that all evil is gratuitous, and theism can't accept any gratuitous evil, basically.
That is, evil that does not serve any greater purpose or lead to any greater good.
Right. So
this poses a significant
it's just a piece of position
for all followers of this classical God. By maintaining that an all-powerful and all-loving God exists, theists are committed to a worldview that cannot admit of any gratuitous evil whatsoever. None.
Yeah, so this is absolutely true. It doesn't mean that theists can't admit of any gratuitous suffering, but it does mean that theists can't admit of any evil, anything that is against existence that is not permitted by existence's own structures. That means that anything that is actually realized within existence, within nature, has to actually be either a controlled measure of evil that's allowed by the freedom of reality, or and it's not obvious that that there's a good case against this, is that he doesn't put forth any evidence against the claim that this is the best of all possible universes, except on these very intuitive emotional arguments regarding regarding the suffering of individuals. But if this general framework of self-utility in the CTMU is correct, then existence cannot permit any gratuitous evil and anything. So basically, there's no way that he's actually supporting his model using logical argument.
To them, every single instance of gratuitous evil must necessarily be an illusion. So when, for instance, we discuss a massive
product of a bad model, it's not that it's an illusion, it's just that it's a product of his like having wrong definitions.
Yeah, exactly. It's like gratuitous is not, there's nothing in reality that is gratuitous from its own self-definitional perspective. So he's just basically defining a contradiction and saying that theism can't admit that, where actually that's a point in its strength, is that theism is actually capable of explaining evil within a broader global logical model. So so what he's putting forth as a fatal weakness is actually something that's just implied by the structure of the theist worldview in the CTMU.
Extinction, in which millions of sentient beings suffer horrendous and often prolonged deaths. Rather than recognizing that, yes, gratuitous evil exists, theists have to spin a story, a theodicy, so that they can confidently declare, this must...
That's the phrase he's using to say that we use a different model, right? A different set of definitions, a different set of distinctions and relationships. Of course, it's going to be affected by the model that you use.
Yeah.
Must be for the best somehow. And they must do this with every single instance of gratuitous evil. This can't be stressed enough. Be it natural disasters such as earthquakes, tsunamis, and hurricanes, or human atrocities such as the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide. Theists must continue to insist that, well, I know that it doesn't look like it, but this must be for the best somehow. To really get this on the table, let's consider a few more instances of what appears to be gratuitous evil. Leukemia in children, forest fires that incinerate wildlife.
So really the strongest example that he has of natural evil would be this the potential for child cancer patients. And in such cases, or similar cases, what the CTMU model would tell us is that the person's higher self has coupled them with that condition because it's part of their destiny. And this just presents the person with the opportunity to become an example of great self-discipline to other people, and therefore to be of utility in that manner.
Yeah, exactly. So these are formulated as opportunities or catalysts, as are some other instances of evil which might be viewed as gratuitous.
Infectious diseases such as malaria, smallpox, and HIV. Birth defects that often deform and cripple an animal's capacity to survive. Then we have predators such as lions, crocodiles, and snakes that must, I repeat, must inflict untold horrors on other sentient beings to survive. These predators are designed through evolution or creation to do this. This isn't a bug. It's a feature. God gave them their weapons and ensured that they must use them on the innocent.
So yeah,
and what about parasites?
That's the same flaw, right? That's reappearing. So firstly, just defining suffering to be evil, but also ignoring like the self-selection aspect. So natural selection is just like a subset of the self-selection of reality, like this the global self-configuration of reality. So that the ecosystem is it's a set of potentials which exist in a larger potential, the larger potential being natural selection or laws of evolution. And each species is like a potential, and the members of each species just actualize their fate through the utility function. And you need the entire system to actually lead toward the utility of the ecosystem. The goal of natural selection and predation, as he's highlighting as it being evil, is utility itself. It's not evil. It's the ecosystem as a whole is just driving towards a function, like a utile function on the planet, so that everything can cooperate, and so that you can have, like as you earlier said, to have things like intelligence at the higher levels and social organization.
Such as ticks, fleas, and tapeworms, with the life cycle of some consisting of eating their host from the inside out. These teleological evils, we're told, must be for the best somehow. To believe this, I argue, is to be profoundly irrational. Having a faith this strong only serves to protect you from reason. Now, in my experience, theists tend to fail in grasping the irrationality at play here, and so let me flip the script through the work of Stephen Law. Suppose that I believed in an all-powerful and all-evil God, which entails that he has unlimited power and will always act as to create the greater evil.
So this is actually an important, another snuck premise that he is bringing in, is that an all-powerful and all-evil God could exist, where we've defined thus far evil as kind of the negation of existence, as that which existence is striving not to be, where God cannot be all evil, because an all good God is a God that selects for utility. An all evil God would select for negative utility, which would negate his own existence. So basically, that would be a self-extinguishing being that would basically go out of existence by virtue of what they themselves want. So an all-powerful God that continues to exist is necessarily an all-good God. And any God which selects for utility is an all-good God. Any other utility has to be defined as God's self-utility, because if God defined his utility as anything else, it would be what he currently selects for, which is his own self-attributed value, the expression of himself in the created world. So utility is basically not definable except as the existence and the expression of the existence of that greatest being.
Yeah, so the problem with the all-evil God is that the highest level of reality, or reality at the global level, it has to select for itself, and since it exists, it has to select for systems which contribute toward their own existence. Whereas if you select for disutility, right, disutility is just stuff that drives the system out of existence. So that this is the reason for the utility function, right? The purpose of the utility function for showing what good is versus what evil is to make sure that good is selected at the global level. So if you have an all-evil God, well, then it selects for evil, and then it's going to select against every system that's good and that sustains existence in general, and then it's just going to drive itself out of existence, and it doesn't exist anymore.
And when I'm presented with something that's seemingly obviously good, such as children playing as they cultivate lifelong friendships and love, I argue that this is an illusion of good. Can't you see that God has intentionally allowed for moments of good as a way to intensify the suffering that follows? After all, if you didn't love that person before God gave them cancer, then you wouldn't have experienced the pain that you still do, even to this day. God is wise in his cruelty. Don't you know? Then suppose you gave me countless other examples of seemingly obvious good, and yet I didn't budge at all. No, I confidently declare, this all might appear rather lovely, but I assure you, this must be for the worst somehow.
So
technically, I would indeed
I'd just say that we accept the pattern there. Like, so you need good to contrast with evil, and you need a function in order to select either one. But in both cases, in both theism and the situation, the hypothetical situation that he's trying to use as a counter argument, in both those situations, the presence of one can lead to the generation of the other, just because other beings, as well as the global being, global reality, they both have this utility function at their disposal, so they can see evil and then choose to create good in response. But also on the global level, global reality can just self-configure by seeing that you've done some evil and then choosing to exclude you from reality, which would be good, right? So if reality excludes people who prove themselves to be evil by removing them from reality, then that's a good thing, right? And of course, that relationship maps over to his all-evil God example. So, the model that we have offered, right, the relationship between utility and disutility, and the utility function and global reality, that's perfectly consistent on his hypothetical all-evil God scenario, because you can imagine an all-evil God that sees people acting good and chooses to remove them from reality. So then that would be for the worst, right? That would be that goodness would be for the worst in that example. So this is just me explaining that his counterexample doesn't work against the CTMU model. So that's that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's pretty much the rest of the video is actually a different line of argument, but just to kind of wrap up is that the reason why his argument can't be valid for why theism is irrational on the basis of the problem of evil is that existence is the self-reinforcement of identity, and therefore existence cannot be divorced from positive utility. You can't deny that if we define God as ultimate reality, that reality has positive utility towards itself, or else it is self-contradicting or self-negating. It is acting against its interests. So therefore, reality can either have no utility at all, or it can have positive utility. But it can't have negative utility, right? It can't be acting against itself, because that would be a contradiction. So he thinks that there isn't an omnibenevolent utility function, but there is, and that function confers us with free will, which is why we see, and actually confers that on the nature of biological systems, which is why, you know, as he says, like life and nature seems to louse up this perfect structure. But if you take everything into account and think about what nature is trying to actually achieve, which is this fitness and adaptivity, find out is that if you take all of that structure, then we are actually in the best of all possible worlds, because it is perfectly structured for the self-utility of reality. That anything that exists in nature is of positive utility, because it is specified that way within the global logical self model of the CTMU, where we define the good as that which is selected by nature. So therefore, it is rational to believe in the existence of a good God on the basis of the observed facts of nature. So I hope that that's given you some context for what some of the logical holes in a very common argument, by the way. This isn't just this guy who came up with this, of how the existence of natural evil somehow negates the possibility of a good God or well-structured existence. Is that that's actually not only is theism rational, but that is irrational, because it's going against this logical model wherein we've actually specified what is good, what is utility, what is of value. And if you actually take and think about each of those questions instead of just going on intuitive or emotional grounds, then you get to a pretty specific and clear case for why reality has to actually have perfect structure for its own self-utility, which is defined as the good. So yeah, we'll close out. Thank you so much to Adam for coming in, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed. Take care. God bless.
God bless.